Buenos días a todas y todos. En nombre de la Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe, en específico la División de Comercio Internacional e Integración, les damos la cordial bienvenida a este webinar que se organiza sobre el tema del comercio internacional de servicios entre América Latina y el Caribe y la Unión Europea. Quisiera también dar la bienvenida en nombre del programa ADELA, de la Fundación Konrad Adenauer, que después mi colega Marce Gómez va a direccionar algunas palabras a ustedes. Y también en nombre de justamente de la red que nos une a esos organismos, que es la RED Latinoamericana de Comercio y Investigación y Políticas en Servicios. Entonces, esa es la asociación, la REDLAS, que existe ya más de 10 años. Hemos organizado conferencias a lo largo de esos 10 años y también en los últimos años un conjunto de webinarios sobre temas que nos convoca en la investigación y políticas en el tema de comercio internacional de servicios y también su economía. En el día de hoy justamente nos convoca el tema del comercio entre América Latina y la Unión Europea, y en este contexto tenemos el gran placer de tener tres muy destacados panelistas, que son Romina Gaya, Sandy Callaghan de la Comisión Europea y también a Pascal Kernais de justamente la Foro Europeo de Servicios. Yo voy a brevemente introducir esos tres panelistas y después vamos a comenzar con una primera ronda de preguntas. Romina Gaya es consultora internacional, docente del UNIVO, de UCA y UADE y también investigadora internacional asociada de USAL. Romina es experta en comercio internacional en servicios basado en el conocimiento. Durante sus últimos 20 años de trayectoria laboral se ha desempeñado como consultora independiente para gremios empresariales, instituciones gubernamentales y también organismos internacionales como ALADI, CEPAL, UNCTAD, BIT y también Secretaría de Mercosur. También es profesora de Economía Internacional en la Universidad de Bolonia, UCA, UADE, y investigadora asociada a la Universidad de El Salvador. Ella es ponente habitual en conferencias sobre comercio de servicios y autora de varias publicaciones. Romina es licenciada en Economía de la Universidad de Toulouse, en Francia, y también la Universidad de El Salvador, y tiene un magíster en Relaciones Económicas Internacionales de la Universidad de Barcelona y la Universidad San Andrés. Nuestro segundo panelista es Pascal Kernais, que es director general del Foro Europeo de Servicios. Él fue nombrado director gerente del Foro Europeo de Servicios en 1999. El Foro Europeo de Servicios es la voz de la industria de servicios en Europa en las negociaciones internacionales de comercio y también de inversión extranjera directa. Él es miembro desde hace muchos años también del Grupo de Contacto de la Sociedad Civil de Comercio de la Comisión Europea. También es miembro del Grupo Consultivo Nacionales Europeos, el DAC, establecidos por los países latinoamericanos en la Unión Europea, incluido en negociaciones como la CETA, justamente el acuerdo entre Canadá y la Unión Europea, y también el acuerdo en el contexto con el Reino Unido. Él participó en varias conferencias ministeriales de la OMC como asesor de la Comisión y también es experto legal en la Comisión Europea en Bruselas entre 88 y 90. Y luego trabajó para la Federación Bancaria Europea como asesor en asuntos internacionales. Pascal tiene un doctorado en Derecho Europeo obtenido en Francia. Y el tercer y último panelista es Sandy Callaghan. Ella es negociadora de comercio de servicios en la Comisión Europea. Una breve característica de su carrera que ella trabajó en el sector privado en Shell, donde trabajó en Londres, Omán, Brunei y Aberdeen, y se incorporó en la Comisión Europea en el año 94, trabajando inicialmente en el DG Industry, pasar luego después en DG Enterprise, se unió a DG Trade en el año 2001. Es una negociadora muy experimentada tanto en servicios como en inversiones y actualmente es negociador principal en acuerdos que la Unión Europea está negociando con Australia y también negociador de servicios financieros en un acuerdo con la India. En el pasado ha negociado servicios financieros con China en el contexto de las negociaciones del acuerdo de inversión, tal como con Chile y Nueva Zelanda. Anteriormente lideró la negociación de inversiones entre la Unión Europea y México en el contexto de las negociaciones del Tratado de Libre Comercio con este país y también con Mercosur. Entonces, como ustedes ven, tenemos un set de panelistas muy experimentadas y justamente ahora quisiéramos pasar al primer panel, pero antes de eso quisiera pasar la palabra a Marce Gómez, coordinadora de proyectos en el programa ADELA de la Konrad Adenauer desde Panamá.
Muchas gracias, Nano, y muchísimas gracias a todos y todas los que nos acompañan el día de hoy en esta conferencia, en la cual esperamos que sea de gran interés y apoyo para todos y todas. De parte de la Fundación Konrad Adenauer, es un gusto y les damos la más cordial bienvenida. Importante mencionar que para nuestra organización, justo el tema de comercio internacional es uno de los ejes de trabajo que realizamos, especialmente con la CEPAL, en la cual también agradecemos a Nano por todo su apoyo en todos los procesos y a todos los colegas que nos acompañan el día de hoy. También trabajamos en otras áreas, como lo es el tema de multilateralismo, el tema del trabajo aquí en Panamá y Agenda 2030, en el cual con gusto les invitamos tanto a ver otras conferencias que hemos realizado con anterioridad, al igual que las conferencias que tendremos a futuro, que se encuentran también en el YouTube o bien en la página de REDLAS y con la CEPAL, al igual que publicaciones. It's important also to tell you, es importante mencionarle a todos y todas que contamos con interpretación simultánea. We have simultaneous interpretation that you can change under the symbol of the world globe. Contamos también con interpretación en español e inglés. Por favor, pueden cambiarlo en la parte de abajo de sus pantallas. Y todos y todas los que nos acompañan, si desean realizar preguntas o consultas, con gusto lo pueden hacer por medio del chat o bien en medio de la parte de Q&A que se encuentra. Muchísimas gracias a todos y todas y esperamos tener un excelente espacio. Por mí, señor Romina Gaya, Sandra Callaghan, en Pascal Tenis, gracias por su apoyo en este espacio. Nano.
Muchas gracias, Marce, por también la introducción y por recordar que tenemos traducción simultánea y también la posibilidad de dirigir preguntas a los panelistas, que vamos a tener un espacio de preguntas y respuestas al final de este webinario. Entonces, ahora vamos a iniciar la primera ronda de preguntas a los muy destacados panelistas y quisiera comenzar con Romina. Romina, tú has sido una analista desde bastante tiempo del tema de comercio de servicios de manera general, pero también de manera más específica con ciertos socios estratégicos de América Latina, que son los países de la Unión Europea. Y en este contexto te quisiera preguntar si nos podías describir un poquito las principales tendencias que tú ves en el comercio de servicios entre la Unión Europea y América Latina desde el año 2010. Y también te quería preguntar en este mismo contexto de cómo se para este dinamismo del comercio de servicios entre la Unión Europea y América Latina en relación a otros socios estratégicos de América Latina, que son sobre todo la propia región y los Estados Unidos. Entonces, Romina, adelante, 8 minutos, por favor.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Primero, gracias por la presentación y gracias a CEPAL y a la Fundación Konrad Adenauer por la invitación. Para mí es un gusto y un honor estar acá con ustedes. Bueno, antes de presentarles algunas tendencias del comercio bilateral entre la Unión Europea y América Latina, me gustaría hacer dos comentarios. Por un lado, que ustedes saben que hay problemas muy serios en la disponibilidad de estadísticas de comercio de servicios, y en América Latina esto es especialmente importante porque no tenemos información desagregada por socio comercial en la mayoría de los países. Entonces, la información que les voy a presentar proviene de las estadísticas de Eurostat, o sea, de lo que la Unión Europea reporta el comercio con América Latina, y si bien la voy a comparar con el total, no son estrictamente comparables porque son fuentes distintas. Y también me voy a focalizar en América Latina y no en el Caribe, porque hay algunas distorsiones en los datos hasta el 2019 relacionados con el comercio de los países de la Unión Europea con algunos territorios del Caribe, como por ejemplo Islas Caimán o Bermuda o Islas Vírgenes Británicas, que introducen algunas distorsiones. Entonces me voy a concentrar en el comercio de la Unión Europea con Sudamérica, Centroamérica y México. Dicho esto, paso a mostrarles algunos datos. Como pueden ver en este gráfico, el comercio entre la Unión Europea y América Latina creció durante el periodo 2012-2019, tanto en las exportaciones como en las importaciones crecieron a un ritmo anual promedio acumulativo de 3,5%, hasta llegar a casi 59.000 millones de dólares en el caso de las exportaciones de América Latina a la Unión Europea, y 30.000 millones en el caso de las exportaciones de Latinoamérica a la Unión Europea. Luego, obviamente, cayó en el contexto de la pandemia, especialmente por los servicios que requieren interacción cara a cara, ¿sí? O sea, el transporte y los viajes en particular. Como pueden ver aquí, la Unión Europea tiene un superávit en el comercio bilateral con las tres regiones, ¿sí? Sudamérica, México y Centroamérica, en todos los casos, y lo que me consultaba Nano sobre la comparación con el resto del comercio, como pueden ver aquí, el comercio de la Unión Europea con América Latina fue más dinámico que el comercio de América Latina con el resto del mundo durante todo este periodo. Entonces, la Unión Europea ganó participación tanto como destino de exportaciones de América Latina como en calidad de origen de las importaciones. En particular esto último, ¿sí? Como pueden ver en este gráfico, está desagregado por región, pero la línea más oscura corresponde al total de estas tres regiones. La participación de la Unión Europea como proveedora de importaciones de servicios de la región pasó de casi la cuarta parte a casi la tercera parte durante todo este periodo, y digamos, ahí está el impacto de la pandemia en el caso de México, que se ve la caída en el 2020, pero en líneas generales vemos que la tendencia fue positiva en todas las regiones. Así la Unión Europea es el segundo origen de importaciones de América Latina después de Estados Unidos. En el caso de las exportaciones de América Latina, si bien el aumento fue mucho más bajo, de apenas 1,2 puntos porcentuales, la Unión Europea es destino de aproximadamente un poco menos de la quinta parte de las exportaciones de América Latina, y digamos, tiene mayor importancia relativa en el caso de Sudamérica. Al igual que en el caso de las importaciones, la Unión Europea es el segundo socio después de Estados Unidos. Y esta relación de la Unión Europea, digamos, por detrás de Estados Unidos, tiene que ver con distintos elementos, pero en primer lugar, un tema de uso horario. Muchos de los servicios que comercia América Latina, sobre todo con Estados Unidos, requieren interacción en tiempo real, entonces la similitud horaria, bueno, también idiomática, cultural, es muy importante. Entonces por eso las exportaciones de América Latina se concentran en ese destino y no tanto en la Unión Europea, ¿sí? En términos de la composición geográfica, no hay grandes sorpresas. Más de la mitad del comercio de la Unión Europea con la región se concentra en Brasil y México, que son las dos economías más grandes de toda América Latina, seguida por Argentina, Chile y Colombia, que son también digamos, después de Brasil y México, de las economías más grandes de la región. aparece sí Panamá en el caso de las importaciones. Acá como no tenemos datos desagregados de la composición del comercio, sí, ya no podemos decir mucho más, pero en términos geográficos sí, no hay grandes sorpresas. En cuanto a la composición de sectores, podemos ver que las exportaciones de la Unión Europea, América Latina, que es la parte de la izquierda en este gráfico, están bastante diversificadas en términos de sectores, en particular en el caso de México y el Centroamérica y Caribe. Acá sí está el Caribe, porque no podemos separar a Centroamérica y Caribe por la disponibilidad de información. Están bastante diversificadas entre sectores, mientras que en el caso de Sudamérica la mitad corresponde a transporte y viajes, ¿sí? En el caso de Sudamérica, las importaciones del resto de los servicios también provienen principalmente de Estados Unidos, y Unión Europea es un proveedor menos relevante en este caso. En el caso de lo que la Unión Europea le compra a América Latina, lo que vemos en la parte derecha del gráfico, bueno, en el caso de Sudamérica y México, vemos que también la mitad del comercio corresponde a los servicios más tradicionales, ¿sí? O sea, a viajes y a transporte, pero estos países también exportan servicios profesionales y técnicos también, y algo de servicios también de informática, son los rubros que también se destacan en esta categoría. En el caso del Caribe, como mencionaba hace unos minutos, esto está distorsionado por lo que tiene que ver con pagos relacionados con la propiedad intelectual de empresas tecnológicas, y estos son los datos de 2019, y estos son principalmente importaciones que hace Irlanda desde Bermuda, Islas Caimán y también las Islas Vírgenes Británicas, y por eso es que vemos esta composición tan diferente respecto del resto de la región. Creo que para dar una introducción podemos dejar acá, y en todo caso luego podemos hacer más comentarios en detalle. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Romina, por este panorama importante que justamente resalta la importancia de la Unión Europea como socio comercial en el comercio de servicios, y que también una canasta muy diversificada por parte de la Unión Europea hacia sus exportaciones a la América Latina. Al contrario, nuestras exportaciones de servicios hacia la Unión Europea siguen de una manera bastante concentrada en el rubro de turismo y también en el transporte. Entonces, sin duda, nos queda un espacio importante por ganar en el área de lo que llamamos servicios modernos o servicios facilitados por medios digitales. Entonces, ahora pasamos la palabra a Pascal. I will switch to English, Pascal, so there's no misinterpretation of the question. And I would like to ask you, Pascal, how important is Latin America and the Caribbean as a market for European services exporters? Who, in particular countries and sectors, are the main players? What are the main markets for the European Union in terms of exports, and what role does foreign direct investment of the European Union play to deliver multi services?
Well, thank you very much, Nano. I hope you can see the screen. Sure. Do you see the slides?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So I'm going to look a bit at the same thing that Romina did, but maybe in a different way. First of all, this is the figures of EU export to the world. The evolution. I'm going to focus on the 4 years between 2015 to 2019. Is as Romina said, indeed, after the COVID, we've got to drop this. If we take these 5 years, we can see that the EU export to the rest of the world has increased by 21%, and the import 19%. I wanted to share whether this would be also the case with Latin American countries. So here's the figures of export between EU and Mercosur, the 4 countries, and there we can see that we have only an increase of 11% instead of 21%. So we did less, export less to the Mercosur than the rest of the world, while the import is even much worse, because for the 5 years, you can see that import from Mercosur to the EU in trading services have been actually flat, which is an interesting to look at, and it's interesting to see what would be the consequences of that. But if you look at the Mercosur, Chile and Mexico, instead I could have gone to others, but that was already there. So we can see the EU exported 29% in 4 years, which is significant, and larger than the average than the rest of the world. And the import of services from the region to the European Union has increased by 20%. So that means that we have here much better than the average, the rest of the world. And it means clearly that Chile and Mexico have outperformed the export and import and relationship between the European Union on trading services, whether it is linked to the agreements that we have with Chile and Mexico, which are not yet ratified, but we have always seen that when there is an agreement in the making, the markets can anticipate and see whether the conditions are going to improve, and therefore maybe that's a possibility of explanation, but we will have to see in a longer term. Also interesting to look at EU, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, where there the export has even increased much better, and nearly 40% in 4 years between these 3 countries and the EU. So the EU has exported a lot of services in the last 4 years, and that is, it is a possibility that it is linked to the trade agreement. The import has been a little bit less than the EU average, so maybe there is some effort to be done there to try to improve the export from the Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador to the European Union in trading services. If I continue, then we have Central America, and here you can see we're much lower than the average of the EU. So only 8% of export from the EU to the Central American countries, and 6% of import. It is much lower. Maybe a possibility would be that indeed, the explanation of that is that EU and Central America agreement on trading services is very weak. The market access, new market access are very poor. So I would also add probably the lack of transparency in the regulation, so that there is difficulties for the companies to know both sides how to do business there. And indeed also we have to admit it is a small market, and therefore this may be less focus in increasing the trade into this region. So all the Latin American countries altogether, nevertheless, interesting to see that the export is higher than the EU average and the import is a bit lower. But it is nothing really so major. So I was thinking when I started to analyze these figures that the Latin America would have a much lower rate of increase of trading services than it is the case. So it is not badly performing, and I think that is important to say. Now, if I want to go to the sectors with which we negotiate, we trade with Latin America, this is the EU export and import with the rest of the world. So this is how the EU is exporting. This in 2021. The travel part is a bit probably lower than it used to be in 2019 because of the COVID. I mean, 21 we have started to retravel, but less. So that's probably a bit more important when we will come back to normal. So transport is only 19%. And we have the telecom and computer services up to 20%, and other business services where you have all of those services, professional services, management consulting services, all of those services around the products themselves, most of them already done through digital. So if we take the 24% plus 20%, is nearly 45% of all EU export now are focused on digital related services. And I think that is really important to look at. And we do even more in terms of import. We focus very much on these services. So 1 or 2 decades ago, major services export used to be transport, travel. Now the focus is more on other business services and IT and computer services. But if I cannot do such an examination with all the Latin American countries altogether, because it will make no sense. I just gave you, for the sake of time, only the compare with Brazil in 2019, which was normally the peak. You can see that transport and travel is taking the most of the export to the region, while the computer services are only 7% and the business services 20%. So you can see that the evolution of trade in services between the EU and Brazil, for instance, is not looking the same that what we had for the rest of the world. So that there is something that to look at there, because I think there is a need to try to focus on the new services that the EU is exporting to the rest of the world. Quickly looking at which countries, which are the major players. When we look at the rest of the world, the major exporter of the European Union to the rest of the world is amazingly Ireland, followed by Germany, France, Netherlands, Denmark. But you can see that Spain and Italy, for instance, are rather low into the ranking. The reason why Ireland is so big is clearly linked to digital trade between EU and United States of America. But if I look at the export to Brazil by the European Union, you can see that Germany and France are still very strong countries there. Spain and Portugal and Italy are much bigger than they are with the rest of the world. So that is something that I wanted to share with you for this session. Also, maybe replying to your last part of your question, Nano, about mode 3 and the investment part. It is true that the way services exporters do business in other countries, it is essentially not anymore, but nevertheless, the biggest share is indeed what we call mode 3, which is the commercial presence abroad. Now more and more the digital trade is taking a big importance. So cross-border trade without having none of the buyer or of the provider moving. But foreign direct investment is nevertheless the major interesting part for doing business outside, creating a presence in a country and have a local presence on site, face-to-face services with the consumers on site. This investment is very big between the EU and Latin America, and the EU is a big investor in countries like Mexico and Brazil, for instance. But when we look at the trend, we can see that actually it has not increased very much in the last decade. And my analysis would be that I think these well-established services providers, like in telecom, the banking and insurance, are now part of the local economy. They are well established there, and there is probably lack of competition, lack of incentive for competition there, which means that these investments are secure, but they are not really contributing to eventually pushing further the economy. I will stop here.
Thanks, Pascal, for presenting the European perspective on the trade and services between the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean. And I was glad to see that, in particular, the EU exports to Latin America have been quite dynamic. The other way around has not been growing very much, but this is also linked, I think, to the overall economic situation of Latin America, where we haven't seen much growth over the past decade. So I think this also reflects the dynamics of the services exporters. And we see the same pattern to other parts of the world in terms of Latin American exports. Now, third in line is Sandy. Sandy, you present the European Commission, and you have been extremely important to promote trade between Latin America and the Caribbean through the signing and modernizing of multiple association agreements. So my first question would be, what is your view, what is the view on of the European Commission on how these association agreements, and in particular the trade pillar of these agreements, have contributed to the dynamics of trade and services? And maybe in the next round we could go a little bit into the modernizing of the association agreements. But first of all, like taking stock, what is sort of the view of the Commission in relation to the agreements that have been negotiated over, I think, a long period of time, for already more than 10 years. So how have the services chapters of these association agreements contributed to the trade dynamics? Do you have any evidence on this? Is it more anecdotal? So please give us your view.
Thanks, Nano. I think you have to understand, particularly from what other colleagues have said, that maybe the statistics are not always so helpful. But maybe I think it's better that I explain, first of all, what agreements on services actually do. They're different from goods, which are aimed at removing tariff barriers. Services agreements and commitments in our agreements are really about providing predictability, stability, and transparency. Not so much about liberalizing, but rather binding what the current situation is in terms of liberalization and restricting the ability of governments and regulators in future to introduce new barriers, so reducing the future policy space. Services are a lot more complex. Pascal has already indicated that services can be delivered in different ways. Through investment, of course, which is, as he's indicated, the most important mechanism, but also cross-border. And one area which perhaps he didn't mention so much is what we call the temporary movement of services suppliers. When one service supplier as a human being travels to another country to deliver a service. And there are different issues associated with each type of provision. So what we try to address in a trade agreement is particularly to remove discrimination. That means that we want to make sure that service suppliers are given the same treatment as a domestic service supplier if possible, and that they are all foreign service suppliers are treated equally, that the United States, for instance, doesn't get better treatment in Mexico than the EU would. In addition to that, we have something we call quantitative restrictions, and that's about numerical limits. Limits, for instance, on how many transactions that you could carry out as a service supplier, or on how many suppliers are permitted to provide a service. And there you have things like monopolies, which constrain the market and prevent anyone from supplying services, and exclusive rights. You may only allow 10 banks to exist on your territory. So as I indicated, investment is the most important mechanism. And these days, I have to say, there are not so many barriers. Most countries recognize how important investment is to their economies. They want foreign investment. They want to attract foreign capital. Used to be that there were many limitations in the form of equity caps, but those are really sort of the last century barriers, and not so many remain. They were already fairly liberalized even under the GATS. Cross-border is a much more complicated area. You're talking about feasibility. You can easily deliver advice and consultancy across borders, but it's hard to regulate suppliers that are not in your territory. You want to ensure that a supplier has the same qualifications, that they meet the same quality standards, and that your consumers are protected. So although more countries are becoming relaxed about certain services being provided on a cross-border basis, and you are getting more commitments, less policy space there in that area, you still find that a lot of regulators are very concerned about cross-border services. Financial services is a perfect example. There are very few financial services that are allowed to be provided on cross-border conditions on a very open basis. It's a very important area where there needs to be a very close cooperation between regulators to allow those services. And then, as I indicated, you have temporary movement, which is really the most sensitive area for many countries because it has a linkage to immigration concerns. But it's also true that many services require physical presence to be supplied. You have a number of professions like doctors or veterinarians, nursing, etc. Countries are largely relaxed about allowing people to come as what we would call intra-corporate transferees. This means that they are employees in your home office and you move them to work for a period of several years in your subsidiary, which is established in the other country. But more independent categories of suppliers, which are not linked to having a company established in the territory, are always more difficult and tend to be more restricted. But we are starting to see more substantive commitments being taken in a bilateral context than existed during the GATS. Trade agreements also address facilitation issues. So we have something called domestic regulation disciplines, where we impose certain criteria on licensing and authorization procedures to ensure that they are as clear as possible and that they remove subjectivity and are very objective, easy for suppliers, that they have important access to review if they are rejected and able to challenge this. All of that is included in our agreements, as well as increasingly mutual recognition of professional qualifications. Many professions require a qualification: engineering, architecture, legal services. All these professional services generally tend to require qualifications. And recognizing these qualifications between different jurisdictions facilitates trade, but it's not easy to achieve. It took the EU internally many, many years to try and achieve that, and I have to say it's probably still not perfect. And in a bilateral context, we've always had provisions allowing for mutual recognition as part of trade agreements, but until very recently, we hadn't actually really put them into practice. Before the end of this year, though, we will have our first EU mutual recognition agreement with Canada in relation to architects. And I hope that this will act as an incentive for promoting this concept with other countries with whom we have the possibility to do this. So for me, one of the most important benefits provided by free trade agreements is in signaling. It sends a strong political message of the interest and the engagement that exists on both sides. It means we are entering into a new special trading relationship, and we view this as a set of new opportunities between the participants in a trade agreement. It's very difficult to quantify the effects. For goods, you can detect the utilization of preferential tariffs. For services, sometimes you see things like investment going up afterwards as investors are attracted. They hear the political message being sent. They know what the regime is because you get a lot more transparency in the agreement. So that can be one of the signals. But as I said, it's really not something that is as easy to detect as you can in the context of trade in goods. And I have to say, for services in particular, there is a new world after COVID. Many more people are working online and providing services online, as I am doing right now. It will take time for this to become more normal and for regulators to decide if and how to regulate this new environment. So I expect bilateral services trade to increase, but it's not really possible at this point in time to predict exactly how much and in which precise sectors that will happen.
Thank you, Sandra, for explaining this very important contribution of trade agreements And as you mentioned, this is quite complex to measure what exactly is their contribution, how much of the trade dynamics is being explained by trade agreements, being its main function a signaling effect to producers and to buyers as well in two different countries. And I also like to recall what you said, that indeed after COVID, we are living in a new world, and many of the face-to-face transactions that were taking place before the pandemic have been replaced by sort of online interactions. And this webinar is one example of these. And many business transactions and measurement challenges, as Romina also mentioned, and Pascal. We need to grapple with this new reality moving forward. But again, I think it's very important that the EU from the outset has put an important emphasis on the inclusion of services chapters in its association agreements. And that certainly, I think, has led to a stabilization of the regulatory environment, and also set the scene for maybe future improved market access, both for EU exporters of services to the Latin American markets with whom you have an association agreements, but also for exporters from our region to the European Union. And I think you also pointed out very correctly that the issue of labor mobility, of the temporary move of workers to the European Union to deliver a service remains a very challenging topic to deal with. So thank you very much. And with this, we close the first round of discussion. And I would like to pass the floor now on to Marce Gomez of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for the second round. Marce, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Nana. Thank you all for this first round of input that we're having about trade services between Latin America and the Caribbean, as well with Europe. To pass now to the next question in the second round. Again, I would like to motivate our participants to make questions as well in the chat and the Q&A that we have. And I will change now to Spanish to Romina. Romina, en esta segunda ronda me gustaría preguntarte, desde tu experiencia que has tenido, ¿puedes describir un poco cuáles han sido, en relación con la interacción con compañías, gobiernos que hay en la región, cuáles son algunos de los obstáculos que puedes encontrar en la región en el tema para poder exportar de manera digital servicios hacia Europa? ¿Cuáles serían tus pensamientos sobre este tema?
Bueno, gracias, Marci, por la pregunta. Yo creo que deberíamos dividir a las empresas de América Latina en dos grandes grupos a la hora de evaluar la situación del comercio con la Unión Europea. Por un lado, las grandes compañías multinacionales, que las grandes compañías multinacionales en general exportan poco desde América Latina a la Unión Europea y también importan poco desde ahí, porque tienen organizadas sus operaciones en base a estructuras regionales. Entonces, desde América Latina manejan sus negocios con las Américas, o sea, con América Latina y también con Estados Unidos y Canadá. Pero el mercado europeo lo abastecen desde Europa, principalmente desde, en muchos casos, países de Europa Central y Oriental. Entonces, son compañías que cuando están en América Latina no prestan demasiada atención al vínculo comercial con la Unión Europea. Distinto es el caso de las empresas originarias de América Latina y sobre todo de las pymes. En el caso de las pequeñas y medianas empresas, tienen mucho interés en el mercado europeo. En particular, empiezan pensando siempre, sobre todo en el caso de Hispanoamérica, en España, por la similitud cultural e idiomática, pero enfrentan algunas dificultades importantes para exportar desde América Latina, entonces recurren muchas veces al modo 3, o sea, es decir, a través de la inversión en España, para desde ahí atender el mercado español y otros países de Europa, ¿sí? Yo no lo mencioné anteriormente, pero el modo 3, o sea, la prestación de servicios a través de inversión, no está reflejada en las estadísticas que mostré anteriormente. Entonces, obviamente el comercio es mucho más grande, si uno tiene en cuenta eso, pero lamentablemente no tenemos estadísticas desagregadas. Las principales dificultades que enfrentan las compañías, sobre todo las pymes, para prestar servicios desde América Latina a la Unión Europea, tienen que ver, en primer lugar, con cuestiones que no se pueden resolver, como es, por ejemplo, la ubicación geográfica. Para muchas cuestiones, la interacción en tiempo real es importante, y para eso se necesita un uso horario similar, y dependiendo del lugar de América Latina, hay entre 4 y 8 horas de diferencia con Europa, entonces en estos casos puede ser una limitación muchas veces. Y también el tema idiomático. En América Latina se habla español, portugués e inglés, dependiendo del país, e incluso en los países en los cuales no se habla inglés como lengua madre, sí hay mucha gente que habla inglés, entonces por eso se exporta mucho a Estados Unidos, pero hay poco personal bilingüe en francés, en alemán, en holandés o en otros idiomas de la Unión Europea. Entonces esto es una limitación importante, también el tema de la cercanía, y por eso para la región es muy difícil, competir con los países de Europa del Este. Porque, de hecho, por ejemplo, en el caso del mercado español, América Latina era un proveedor mucho más importante hasta la ampliación de la Unión Europea hacia el este, y ahí perdieron mercado frente a Polonia, República Checa, Eslovaquia, sí, a Rumania. Entonces, esto es, digamos, es una realidad que a veces es difícil de solucionar. Y sobre todo, y esa creo que es otra de las principales razones por las cuales Estados Unidos es el mayor destino y no la Unión Europea, es que hay algunas barreras al comercio que son muy importantes, y estas barreras no se abordan en los acuerdos de libre comercio, digamos, en los capítulos de servicios, que tienen que ver con la doble imposición. La doble imposición es el principal obstáculo para exportar servicios a través de Internet desde América Latina, y esto, por más que hay acuerdos para evitar la doble tributación entre ambas regiones, o sea, entre países de la Unión Europea y países de América Latina, sigue habiendo relaciones bilaterales que no están cubiertas, y además algunas dificultades para implementarlos. Y en el caso de Estados Unidos no hace retención de impuesto a la renta cuando importa servicios, sí en el caso de propiedad intelectual, pero no en el de servicios. Entonces para las empresas resulta mucho más fácil dirigirse a ese mercado. Y después, también en muchos casos, la prestación de servicios a través del modo 1 requiere el complemento a través del modo 4, y como mencionó Sandra hace unos minutos, ahí persisten limitaciones importantes relacionadas con la inmigración. Entonces, a veces a las empresas les cuesta mucho prestar los servicios de esa manera. No obstante, creo que hay oportunidades importantes. Recién decía Sandra que digamos, el comercio de servicios cambió mucho a partir de la pandemia, y una dificultad que están enfrentando muchas empresas en todo el mundo es, digamos, tienen dificultad para conseguir el talento necesario para crecer. Entonces, en ese sentido, creo que las empresas de la Unión Europea pueden ampliar sus operaciones con América Latina a través del outsourcing, ¿sí? O sea, de distintas tareas, y también considerarlo como un destino para el modo 3, pero no solamente para prestar servicios en América Latina, sino también para exportar desde América Latina al resto de las Américas. Así que creo que eso es todo por ahora. Gracias.
Marce, por favor, abre tu micrófono.
Pequeños detalles que suceden en conferencias digitales. Muchísimas gracias. Cuando hablamos de este tipo de exportación e importación, es muy interesante el ver también, por un lado, lo que respecta a esas empresas grandes, ¿verdad? Que están mencionando que trabajan a nivel regional en Latinoamérica, pero bien un mercado que se puede desarrollar, que son las pymes. Ahí hablamos también, como mencionaba, limitantes a nivel de talento humano, a nivel de los acuerdos que se pueden brindar y la doble tributación, el idioma. Sería interesante el poder motivar más el aprendizaje de otras lenguas, y también algo que mencionaba Sandra, también este reconocimiento de la titulación de países latinoamericanos en la Unión Europea en ese tipo de carreras o oficios, ingenierías, arquitectura, lo cual me parece excelente. Con Canadá ahora también se esté brindando este espacio de reconocimiento. Y ojalá puede ser un tema que pudiésemos también plantear para Latinoamérica. Al igual que considerando que con los pymes, muchas veces la capacidad suele ser reducida dependiendo del país, y también la posibilidad de hacer un intercambio, un crecimiento de pymes en otros países de Latinoamérica para poder garantizar esta exportación a un mercado europeo, sería interesante poder desarrollar en este espacio. Lo cual, muchísimas gracias, Romina, esperamos que podamos seguir discutiendo esas temáticas para desarrollar. Al igual que, paso a la siguiente pregunta a Pascal. I'm going to change now to English, Pascal. for the following question as well. Based on your interactions also with companies and governments in Europe, what do you see as the main obstacle for Europe more digital to export more digital-enabled services to Latin America and the Caribbean? And also in this context, have the association agreements been important in this regard? And what issues should they modernize their address in the future? We saw the Latin American perspective. It would be great to hear now the European perspective. Thank you very much, Pascal.
Thank you very much, Merci. So to continue on these obstacles to export more digitally enabled services, I fully agree that the language is certainly an obstacle. Also now I think the young people all over Europe will speak English, and therefore I think trading in English on the internet is certainly possible and easier now. Taxation is certainly an issue, but neither language nor taxation are dealt into trade agreements. So that is something that we probably will not be able to achieve through trade policy. I think one of the major obstacles that I would mention, not linked to trade policy either, is connectivity, infrastructure. If I understand, there is only 2 cables, data cables going from Latin America to Europe. The first one was inaugurated in 2017 only between Portugal and Brazil. And there is a new one called ELA Link for Europe Latin America Link, which is covering many countries of Latin America and then going to Europe, had just been inaugurated last year in 2021. There are more than 20 cables between the EU and US. I mean, let's say Europe and US, because now the UK is not anymore in the US, in the EU. But you can see the infrastructure is already an obstacle. The more cables and the more possibility to send data you have, the more we will be able also to trade. So that's probably one of the issues. Another issue I will mention is probably, and you were mentioning the SMEs, which are the bulk of the business, both sides actually between EU and Latin America, is a difficulty possibly to cope with the EU regulation. The EU regulation is a superpower in terms of regulation into the digital world, and we have many initiatives. The Digital Market Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Act, and probably more importantly, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And now we go into Artificial Intelligence Act, Chips Act, semiconductors, etc. So the EU is regulating this field, and if a company doesn't understand what regulation they have to abide with to trade with the European Union, it might be complicated I will not say that they are barrier per se, because this is not the case, and they are not discriminatory, and therefore it's not a barrier that you can go and overcome through an FTA. But the complexity of the world is making certainly things complicated. Now, you know that the EU is providing data adequacy decision for countries who are thinking that their data protection regulation could be in more or less the same equivalence to the European Union. But there is also other transfer mechanism into place. The EU is allowing data to transfer for any Latin American companies willing to be on the e-commerce market or sending data to the EU. The idea is to have either so-called binding corporate rules, but more importantly, the standard contract clauses, where if you want to sell something to European citizens, you have to respect some protection of the data, etc. And that is now, that used to be a little bit blurred and unclear, but now the DigiJustice has made this much more complicated, much more transparent. But nevertheless, I have to admit, for an SME, it is always a bit complicated. Now, how could we try to improve this through the association agreements or the FTAs? When we look at the current, the newest FTA that the EU has signed, as well as maybe countries like Japan and Australia, etc., They have now a new elaborated digital trade chapter, or even we have between EU and UK a digital trade title, which is really encompassing many issues on trade. When we look at the agreements that we have in place between Latin American countries, the e-commerce chapter is either non-existent or very poor. With Central America, it's only 2 articles. It's really at the beginning of the writing of these rules. Colombia, Peru, Ecuador are also a bit outdated. Mercosur Mercosur for us in Europe, in my organization, we're very sad. First of all, because this agreement has difficulty to go through the ratification system, and we are supporting the agreement, but we have to admit that it's an old agreement. Even before being ratified, on the services part, the market access commitment and the rules are very old, and not sure that when it will be ratified, it will increase trade in services. The reason why we are in favor is because we know that the increase of trade in goods will always be accompanied by trade in services through booking and auditing, through lawyers, through all of those business services that I have shown you increasing very much around the products. But for e-commerce, the provisions into this agreement are pretty old, and certainly a review of this agreement will be more than welcome. We have EU-Mexico, which is one of the newest agreements, not yet ratified, hopefully soon, but the e-commerce chapter is good, but the EU and Mexico didn't find an agreement on the so-called cross-border data flow, text and data protection flow. So there is a 3 years review clause. This is what we had with Japan, with Singapore, and many other countries. I hope we will be able to find solution. There is a negotiation currently going on between the EU and Japan on this issue. The reason why Mexico didn't want to follow the EU text was because Mexico is part of the CPTPP. And that is also the case with Chile. But Chile, we have just concluded the negotiation recently, but Chile has accepted the EU text. So we hope that we will be able to move with other CPTPP countries in that direction. But having proper language on cross-border data flow into a trade agreement is certainly giving what Sandra was mentioning, which is the essence of the benefit of the trade agreements, which is predictability, certainty, and stability. So we hope that we'll be able to move in there, and that will certainly contribute to increase digitally trade services.
Thank you very much, Pascal. This is quite interesting as well when you mentioned connectivity. For example, all that theme about data protection as well. If Latin America can improve the infrastructure that we have, maybe we can have a better connection as well. As Romina mentioned, we have a substantial difference between the hours that we work on. So it will be interesting to see how this data flow can work better in both regions. And of course, the regulations are a really big part on how we make trade, mostly with digital trade or e-commerce. And the discussion with the different countries should see also this review between the local regulation as well as international regulations to be adapted in order to improve this process. So thank you very much as well, Pascal. And moving on also to our third question, Sandra. Well, and also in the part of the European Commission, actively seeking to promote digitally enabled services trade through the modernization of your association agreements with trading partners, such as Pascal mentioned, Chile, Mexico. Can you give us more details on this? Or will you extend this modernization also to AE in the region? Finally, how do you see the changes in the European Union and Mercosur agreement being ratified by the EU and the Mercosur member states? How will be this process now on this state? Thank you very much, Sandra.
Okay, good questions. Until recently, as Pascal has made very clear, bilateral trade agreements concluded by the EU only contained a few non-binding provisions on e-commerce and a prohibition of customs duties on electronic transmissions. So that's what you tend to see in most of the older association agreements. The most recent trade agreements, such as those with New Zealand and Chile, contain a self-standing chapter on digital trade, which seeks to establish basic horizontal disciplines that are not specific to any sector, but essential to the efficient functioning of online trade, and that apply across the board. So to online trading goods, to services, to public procurement, all of these things. The rules themselves address various aspects of e-commerce and digital trade. They partly derive from WTO disciplines, which is the customs duties on electronic transmissions, partly from EU legislation, so elements dealing with e-contracts and with spam, and partly they are based on trade barriers that have been identified by European business in some countries, things like mandatory source code disclosure requirements. And some of the rules are also inspired by the UNCITRAL model laws on electronic commerce and electronic signatures. And these relate to electronic contracts. And even if unfortunately, the current drafting might differ a bit significantly from the original provisions, all of this is very important because these are inspired by what is happening dynamically throughout the world. So it's globally, but also within the EU. The overall goal is to ensure, as in other areas, predictability and legal certainty for businesses, a secure online environment for consumers who are engaging in digital trade transactions across borders. And this is a very important aspect of the modernized agenda, to remove unjustified barriers, and to prevent discrimination between online and offline activities. So the types of things that we're trying to address has really expanded in the last few years. The intention is to set standards in the territory of each party on issues that are important for the good functioning of digital trade. But this doesn't mean that there is an extraterritorial application of the law of one of the trading partners. So consumers, for example, are protected by the laws of their own country, even when they're engaging in cross-border transactions. And there's also no aspect of mutual recognition. So we don't deal with electronic trust services. But generally what you'll find in the modernized digital trade chapters that we're working on at the moment is the banning of customs duties on electronic transmissions, although this doesn't prohibit the imposition of internal taxes. We promote electronic contracts, electronic authorization methods, and electronic trust services, e-signatures, e-seals, timestamps, all of which are necessary for validating online transactions and thus make these a key enabler for digital trade. As I mentioned, we want to ensure online consumer protection, including against spam. So you'll see anti-spam provisions as well. We want to prohibit some of the unjustified barriers, such as government access to software source code, which could be used to give that source code to competitors, which would make companies reluctant to engage in transactions where this was a requirement. And also, increasingly, unjustified barriers to data flows, which includes for us data localization requirements, but also the protections that you need for privacy, which are balancing that. And of course, we always have an element of facilitating regulatory cooperation, because to enable digital trade, you're going to need this cooperation between regulators, as we've seen in other areas of services. In respect of future planning for the region, well, digital trade is currently an important priority for the Commission, and our ambition is that any modernized agreement will include a state-of-the-art digital trade chapter, just like the one that we've managed to conclude with Chile. We're not going to obviously modernize Mexico on digital quite yet, at least for the time being. It's a very recent agreement and it's not been implemented yet. It's not exactly as our latest template, but I think we will certainly want to see the agreements actually coming into force before we start modernizing them again. Regarding others in the region, we don't have current specific plans at the moment, but the situation is very dynamic. There clearly needs to be a mutual interest and an indication of compatible approaches. And finally, with regard to Mercosur, for us, it's strategically important, both from an economic perspective and geopolitically. It will facilitate trade and investment with the 5th biggest economy outside the EU. It is the largest trade deal that the EU has ever concluded in terms of tariff savings, because we expect that we would save something like 4 billion euros annually. At the moment, we're engaged in finalizing the text of the agreement. We're doing the legal scrubbing and revisions, and we're still working on what we call geographical indications. But however, we need to make sure that the sustainability concerns that are linked to the agreement have to be addressed before we can put it forward to be ratified. The upcoming election in Brazil this weekend might change the perspective and could help us to address this. But we need to wait for the outcome of the elections and for hopefully a new team to be in place. Once we have that, we can engage with the new authorities to take stock of the situation and assess the perspective of advancing the ratification and under what conditions, including what next steps would be needed and a possible timeline. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sandra. This is also a really big question when we talk about this kind of agreements and the process that we have with different countries as well, because in also technology that changes every day. Every day we find something new, some improvement, some new process, and it's quite interesting to see how these agreements also put this new information to make that regulation between the other countries and to be able to access trading services as well. And we've seen about what's going on with Mercosur to see if we can develop this kind of agreement as well. And to see, of course, the political situation in different countries is also one question when we talk about the process that we do between the different services and trades. Thank you very much, all of you, for your inputs in this subject. It's really quite a big theme that we can keep going and talking. And for that, we would like to address some of the questions that we have here from the participants that we have. And Nano, I'll give you back to the word so we can talk a little bit about these questions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Marce, y muchas gracias a los distintos panelistas por sus aportes muy interesantes con respecto a las distintas preguntas. Efectivamente, tenemos algunas preguntas en el chat y voy a mencionar las distintas preguntas y después pasamos en el mismo orden la palabra a los distintos panelistas. Una primera pregunta que se mencionó es cómo los países europeos ven los servicios exportados por países de América Latina y el Caribe. Y un ejemplo es el software. Entonces hay Pascal tal vez puede responder si en el mercado europeo hay una cierta desconfianza o no de comprar un software realizado en algún país de América Latina o si cumpliendo con estándares de calidad una empresa o un consumidor estaría inclinado a comprar ese software a pesar de estar de una región en desarrollo como es América Latina. Después había un par de preguntas sobre el tema de los datos y varios panelistas ya mencionaron que existe una cierta debilidad en la medición del comercio de servicios. Entonces, tal vez si se podía mencionar cuáles son las fuentes de los datos y si los datos que ustedes han mostrado, Romina y Pascal, se pueden considerar fiables o no. Y tal vez una pregunta que Romina puede responder y si no, yo también te puedo complementar sobre esfuerzos en América Latina para mejorar la medición de los datos de comercio internacional de servicios. Y una pregunta un poco relacionada al tema del comercio bilateral digital. Y ahí tal vez Pascal y Romina, si ustedes tienen conocimientos de herramientas de trabajo colaborativo. Entonces, ¿en qué medida herramientas que han surgido en la pandemia, algunos ya existían, pero se han acelerado en términos de su uso? ¿Qué herramientas existen? Y ustedes ven que eso podía también dinamizar la relación comercial en servicios entre la Unión Europea y América Latina. Y finalmente, una pregunta para Sandy, muy importante, es cómo trata la Unión Europea a países con un menor grado de desarrollo. ¿Ustedes aplican un template como un blueprint a todos sus socios comerciales o hay algún tratado diferencial con respecto a países con un menor grado de desarrollo que también existen en América Latina? Entonces, un set de preguntas bastante contundentes y ojalá que puedan responder en algunos minutos para después tal vez tener una breve ronda final de algunas consultas que están ahora en el Q&A. Y invito a todos y todas que están siguiendo el webinar que pueden dirigir su última consulta a esos panelistas destacados. Entonces, empezamos con Romina. Adelante.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Nano, por las preguntas. Bueno, con respecto a los datos de comercio de servicios, hay grandes limitaciones en todo el mundo. En América Latina es una región que tiene en particular algunos problemas mayores, por ejemplo, a los que hay en la Unión Europea, pero existen muchas dificultades para medir el comercio, sobre todo porque el comercio no pasa a través de las aduanas, como sí sucede en el caso de los bienes. Entonces, digamos, todo lo que se exporta, sobre todo a través de Internet, es muy difícil de medir, y tampoco hay buenas mediciones del comercio a través del modo 3. Dicho esto, lo mejor que tenemos son los datos de la balanza de pagos, que miden las transacciones entre los residentes en una economía y los residentes con el resto del mundo, y digamos, en su clasificación extendida, que nos da un poco más de desagregación. No obstante, hay poco detalle en cuanto al tipo de servicio. Yo vi que había una pregunta, por ejemplo, sobre los distintos tipos de seguros. Bueno, esa información no está disponible. Y también en muchos países no hay datos desagregados por socio comercial. Esto es lo que sucede en la mayor parte de los países de América Latina. Hay algunos países, como Colombia, por ejemplo, que tienen datos desagregados por contraparte. Argentina desagrega a algunos países, Brasil también, pero esto es muy limitado, y cuando uno compara los datos, por ejemplo, de lo que Colombia informa que comercia con la Unión Europea y lo que la Unión Europea informa que comercia con Colombia, son datos muy diferentes. Entonces, esto es una gran limitación para tomar decisiones, es un problema para los gobiernos a la hora de formular políticas públicas o de negociar acuerdos, es un problema para las empresas a la hora de tomar decisiones de inversión, y también es un problema para la academia a la hora de hacer estudios. De todas maneras, utilizamos fuentes lo más confiables que podemos. Si es de un país en particular, uno puede utilizar las del Banco Central o el Instituto de Estadísticas. Cuando buscamos información internacional de organismos internacionales, como UNCTAD o la Organización Mundial del Comercio, bueno, en el caso de la Unión Europea, Eurostat. Hay iniciativas en la región para mejorar la información en el ámbito de la CEPAL o de la LADI y de otros organismos internacionales, por ejemplo a través del intercambio de buenas prácticas. Creo que esto es un ámbito en el cual puede haber mucha cooperación con la Unión Europea, que tiene estadísticas mucho más robustas, sería interesante aprender de ahí. De todas maneras, hay limitaciones para intercambiar información, sobre todo por cuestiones de secreto fiscal y estadístico. Entonces esto es un problema. Y con respecto a la otra pregunta, no entendí bien a qué se referían con herramientas de trabajo colaborativo. No sé si se refieren a plataformas, así que por ahí si pueden aclarar un poco más, puedo ampliar un poco la respuesta. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Romina. Ahora paso la palabra a Pascal.
Well, thank you very much for these questions. I mean, on the question of the software, I don't think there is any specificity that the EU is requiring, and Latin American countries can certainly compete on the same field. Maybe the language is a problem for making it more accessible, but of course, digital language, i.e., the 1 and 0s, is the same for the world. Now, more seriously, it's a new area in which we are entering, where standardizations and certifications of services didn't really exist in the past. But we can see clearly that this is the direction that we're taking, and we will go more and more into standardization and certification of software and artificial intelligence, etc. The problem is standards and services doesn't go together very well so far, and most of the time that when we talk about standardization, we talk about goods. But now we can see that the EU and US in the TTC, the Transatlantic and Trade and Technology Council, are starting to talk about standardization in AI and cloud services. We can see that we are also having different initiatives. The EU has its Indo-Pacific strategy, in which we are starting to negotiated digital partnership agreement with Japan, with Korea, with Singapore, where the word standardization is coming in. I am not aware about any tentative to have any digital partnership agreement with any Latin American countries. That's something maybe which should be put on the agenda if we want to work together. On the reaction of the business side is why there are, I mean, we have to add also the US initiative called IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where the US is working with Asian countries and Australia and New Zealand. Not a single Latin American country is part of this exercise. And they are also moving and talking about standardizations on the digital economy. So if the part of the world, the Latin American part of the world, is willing to be part of the revolution of digital, there is certainly a need to focus on how can we be going into this. From the business side, I wanted to say is we are a bit disappointed by the fact that there are many different bilateral initiatives, apparently all willing to go for the same idea. And my understanding of the word standard is because we have the same, otherwise there is no point. Are we going to have 10 different standards in artificial intelligence or whatever kind of software we're making? That's a big question, and we're just wondering why it is not possible to put all of these persons in the same rooms and discuss about one standard instead of many of them. But that is my reaction on this question. The other question of data statistics, as Romina mentioned, and I fully agree with what she said. On the EU side, we have Eurostat, which is relatively well organized, but it is true, and I'm shouting and claiming and saying that every time I can, and Sandra would know about it, that we talk to the Commission asking for more statistics on trading services. This is now more than 30% of EU trade, and we only have big lines like financial services, 80 billions, these kind of things, but without no specificity. Now, it is true that Eurostat has improved in the last years, and we can find countries by countries statistics a little bit more fine-tuned and sectors by sectors. It is not completely all accurate, and there are also 1 or 2 years late because not all countries give their data at the same time. So we're still looking at 2019 or 2020 figures where we have 2022 is nearly finished, and we know for the last months how many bananas have been traded. So there is a lack of treatment here, a discriminatory treatment for trading services statistics, and I'm calling all the decision makers in this field to trying to find a solution. Nowadays, with digital, everything should be possible, but we still have to continue to push.
Thank you, Pascal, for these remarks and provocation indeed. That with regard to the lag between the data on trading goods and trading services in the difficulty of policymakers, but also like business to conduct any plans and in a situation where the data are really old. So that's really a challenge indeed. Sandy, so there was one question to you with regard to special and differential treatment. And there was an additional question which you may also answer with regards to the gender equality, whether the European Union is also introducing gender equality in the issue of trade and services chapter and the digital chapters as well.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the first word. January?
No, gender
equality. Oh, got you. Gender equality. Okay. I can answer that one quickly. On the services side, in the scope of our chapter, we don't have specific provisions on gender equality, but you'll see in our most recent agreement with New Zealand, we've started to address that, but it's sort of across the board. It's another horizontal issue, and you'll see what we have in New Zealand. It's just sort of the start of this. It's a developing area, like sustainability. How we treat countries with a lower level of development. The EU negotiates with many, many different countries at all stages of development. So we have a lot of agreements, for example, with African countries. Those started off as being largely good agreements, and now increasingly, after a few years, we're expanding them to include services. We engage in a very lengthy, detailed, important, exploratory set of discussions before we negotiate, so that we have really a good mutual understanding on both sides of what to expect and what is possible to achieve. It's important we have good agreements. There's a lot of work that's gone on over the years to refine and improve agreements. So we try not to end up, as unfortunately we have with Mercosur, but there's a good reason for that in having an old style agreement. So we still would expect new negotiating partners to use the type of provisions that we have now in our modernized agreement. The disciplines are the same. The commitments from our side are the same, but we always show flexibility in relation to the commitments that the other countries are taking. So depending on the level of development, we're not going to expect other countries to undertake the same sort of comprehensive commitments that we take in the EU. And we will allow them to retain, obviously, more policy space.
Thank you, Sandy, for this clarification. And now we are coming towards the end of this webinar. I would like to thank again the panelists for your great contributions. And we would like to give sort of a final round to each of you. And if you can, if you have a final word on how you think these trade relations between EU and Latin America in trade and services could be more dynamic towards the future. And also, there was one final question in the chat, whether you think the tensions between the EU, in particular, the United States and China on the one hand, and maybe also the United States, Russia, and also EU-Russia, would give rise to new trading opportunities between Latin America and the Caribbean in trade and services. So feel free to respond to that last question. Otherwise, please 1 minute for a final comment before we close this event. Romina.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Yo creo que hay grandes oportunidades para desarrollar el comercio. El nuevo escenario internacional, un poco ligado a lo que mencionabas recién, ofrece más oportunidades para países como los de América Latina para exportar servicios tanto a Estados Unidos como a la Unión Europea. En el caso de la Unión Europea, creo que el potencial está más por el lado de alianzas que permitan a las compañías europeas ampliar sus operaciones a través de la subcontratación de empresas de América Latina, pero también la inversión en la región, y al revés, desde el punto de vista sobre todo de las pymes de la región, de poder iniciar sus operaciones en la Unión Europea. Pero también creo que se necesita un gran esfuerzo por parte de los gobiernos latinoamericanos para desarrollar algunos problemas, para solucionar algunos problemas estructurales como la conectividad o algunos problemas relacionados con la educación, que pueden contribuir a esto. Así que bueno, muchísimas gracias por la invitación y ha sido un gusto participar.
Muchas gracias, Romina. Pascal.
Thank you, Nano. Well, I just would like to say that it's clear that EU and Latin American countries have a lot of in common. We share many values. We have a very long history together, and trade should even be. I mean, these should be reflected more into trade and investment. Investment, we have already a significant part, but trade should increase more, and we would like to receive much more investment from Latin America into the European Union. And for that, there is a need to take trade in services much more seriously. Because unfortunately, nevertheless, when we talk about trade between the EU and Latin America, it's always one word which is coming back again and again, which is agriculture, agriculture, agriculture. And now raw materials. And that is nothing with services, or not much with services. And I think that's the reason why I think we should try to take trade in services much more seriously into our relationship. Now, yes, I do believe that the war in Ukraine is an opportunity to fasten our relationship. Politics is taking over, and suddenly we hear that the chairman of the Inter Committee saying that we would like to ratify EU Mercosur and EU Mexico and EU Chile. They haven't yet talked about ratification of EU Mercosur, which means that it is sensitive still. So we hope that depending on the result of the elections in Brazil, it will be possible to resurrect this agreement and go through it and let the trade go as it should be going for a long time already. This agreement has taken more than 20 years to be built. It's not perfect, but at least it would be allowed to increase trade. So hopefully that will have also repercussion in all the regions. I'll stop here. Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thanks, Pascal, for these words. And last but not least, Sandy, please.
Okay, I'll try and be short and brief. Look, I do think that there is a lot of opportunity for trade to increase between Latin America and the EU. I expect that the trade in services will be more dynamic in future. Chile and Mexico, I think, are going to lead the way. They've recently agreed with us new provisions, and I think if they can show how they can take advantage of them, then there will be others queuing up and able to do so as well. I think the region has a linguistic advantage because Spanish and Portuguese are languages which are spoken in the EU. So that gives you an advantage which a number of other regions don't have. And you can reach Spanish and Portuguese markets, and then I think move on from there and show how you can grow from there. Because once you're in the EU, you have the entire market there, and you're an insider. You can then learn how to develop and take advantage of the knowledge and experience that Spain and Portugal amongst their own business communities have. With regard to the current tensions, even after COVID, people were looking at supply chains and looking at their relationships with partners and trying to expand them. It's very clear from what's happening in Russia, and also I have to say from what's going on with China, that diversification is something that everyone in Europe is thinking about now. Nobody wants to be completely dependent on anyone else, and everybody wants to diversify. So that can't help but offer more opportunities everywhere, and not just only in goods and raw materials, as Pascal has said, but also in services. And thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. It's been very interesting.
Thanks, Andy, for these final words. So we finish with that, with a world that is open to diversification, and that, of course, could be a trigger to increase trade between our two regions. So again, thank you very much to all the three speakers, all the three panelists. I would just like to recall that the presentations will be both at the ECLAC and also the Konrad Adenauer webpage of the ADELA program. And I would also like to remind that on the 14th and 15th of November, we will have our 11th REDLAS conference taking place in Lima, Peru. And both people are both welcome to attend physically in Lima, but there also will be video streaming. So information will be made available both at the ECLAC and the ADELA website. And we also will send information to the emails that you have provided for this webinar. So thanks again, and I would like to pass the floor to Marce for the final words.
Thank you very much, Nano, and also thank you very much for all our panelists today. It's been quite interesting to see all the points that we have within both regions, and hopefully that we can improve all of the relationships that we have, and mostly in the trade area. And thank you very much, and we hope that we can keep talking about this subject, to keep seeing how is everything going. And it would be great to have all of you again in this process, and as well to invite you to follow the REDLAS conference that Nano already mentioned, and as well the other digital conferences that we're going to have about different subjects about trade, also about China and USA the next one. Thank you very much to all of you, and also Nano for the moderation about this panel. Thank you very much. Also great to do this process with you. So thank you all. Have a really great day. And if you have any other questions, you can also address us to our emails in the both organizations. Thank you very much to all of you. Have a great day.